is brought to you by realestate.com.au, Australia's #1 address in property. With more properties for sale than anywhere else, we make it easier.
Welcome back. Let's take a look at the upcoming auctions around the country this weekend. Sydney has the most auctions with 923 homes going under the hammer and another 185 across the rest of New South Wales. Melbourne has 592 homes up for auction with another 34 around Greater Victoria. Brisbane has 184 homes for auction with another 155 properties going to auction across Queensland. South Australia has a total of 153 auctions, while the nation's capital, Canberra, has 83. Moving on to the most viewed properties going to auction this week, and a home in Queensland tops the list. 9 of the top 20 most viewed homes were in Victoria, 6 were in New South Wales, 3 were in South Australia, and 2 were in Queensland. The most viewed property was 31 Beaconsfield Drive, Burleigh Waters, Queensland. And for those that remember, it's the cement-rendered house we featured on the show a couple of weeks ago. And this week, the most viewed residential listing is 29 Callanans Road, Red Hill South, Victoria. It's about 1 hour south of Melbourne on the Mornington Peninsula. This massive property sits on 6.5 hectares, features 5 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, 6 garage spaces, and a self-cleaning infinity pool and spa. The house, or series of houses really, includes a main homestead surrounded by stables, which have been converted into loft-style accommodation. Inside, there's a stone-finished kitchen, pool room, cocktail lounge, steam room, and even a golf simulator. But outside, there's a synthetic soccer field, tennis court, rose garden, and 2 dams. Doesn't come cheap though. Price guide is $25 million to $27 million. Joining me now is Eleanor Creagh, Senior Economist with REA Group. Eleanor, let's start with this weekend's auctions. About 2,400 homes scheduled this weekend, down from about 3,300 last weekend. Any reasons why the number's down by almost 1,000 properties?
Yeah, look, I think a big driver behind that is the fact that we are actually seeing a decrease in properties going up for auction this week in Victoria relative to that same date last year. And there's also a public holiday in Victoria. So that's a big driver there behind, I guess, that little bit of a drop-off in auction volumes. But actually, when we look at the other states and territories, auction volumes are significantly higher than they were at this same period last year in every other state and territory. In fact, in every other state, auction volumes are around 50% higher than they were at this same time last year. And certainly, you know, to date this year, auction volumes have been far stronger than they were to date over the same period last year. We've really seen that vendors have responded to the easing of restrictions. New listings have surged, and vendors really have confidence to list, given, you know, it's strong selling conditions out there. Buyer demand is still high, and of course they're responding to the recent price growth that we've seen as well.
There's also been a lot of rain on the east coast of Australia. Has that put a dampener at all on property inspections and making vendors delay their auction dates as well?
Yeah, I mean, it could be. And I mean, certainly it's likely that some inspections have been affected. I think what is of note is that actually last week we saw quite a large drop-off in search volumes, particularly in Queensland and New South Wales. In Queensland, we actually saw search volumes declining 19% versus the prior week and 11% in New South Wales. It's not surprising, I guess, that property seekers have had their minds elsewhere, whilst we've had severe wet weather and flooding events on the radar. But certainly that's, you know, there is some day-to-day volatility in search volumes, so we can't always read too much into it. But certainly those were notable declines in search volumes in both New South Wales and Queensland. And it would be reasonable to expect that the wet weather and flooding has deterred some people's property search.
Yeah, well, you mentioned those floods across southeast Queensland, northern New South Wales and northwest Sydney. Do natural disasters like this have any impact on demand for property in those disaster-affected areas?
Yeah, look, I mean, in the near term, certainly yes, there is likely to be some softening in demand in those affected areas. But actually, it's a little bit difficult to pinpoint the effect of adverse weather events on housing values. And actually, looking at previous events, we have seen that over the long run, so say over kind of a 3 to 5 year period, the impact on housing values in those adversely affected regions is pretty negligible. Now, that could change in the future, particularly given we are seeing increased incidents of severe flooding, and I guess with the incidence of flooding and rainfall set to or forecast to increase with the impacts of climate change, you could see that buyers are somewhat more deterred this time around. And certainly if we were to see any response from insurance companies kind of re-rating the risk of properties in certain regions, and insurance premiums picking up, some of those re-ratings to risk can cause quite a significant bump in insurance premiums, then that would also factor into, I guess, shifting trends in buy demand in some of those adversely affected regions as well.
International students, they're starting to return to Australia. What impact's this having on rental markets in the sort of inner city areas?
Certainly. So we're seeing that there's more competition than ever in the rental market at the moment. And actually last month, rental days on site hit a historic low, with the average unit or house being rented out in just 22 days. And where we're seeing rental days on site decline the most is the inner city, and particularly Sydney and Melbourne. So we've seen that actually in Sydney and Melbourne, rental days on site have hit their lowest since the onset of the pandemic. In Sydney, they're at their lowest since March 2017. In Melbourne, they're at their lowest since March 2020. This is as the international borders have reopened. People are returning to capital cities. City life is recovering. All drivers of increased rental demand. And certainly we've seen that, competition has already ramped up, and we're seeing upwards pressure on rents. And, this is likely to get more acute, certainly with a normalisation of international migration on the cards for this year.
Eleanor Creagh, Senior Economist at REA Group, thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me.